podcasts.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Well, hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Sam Hales. The Profile is the show where we delve into a person's life, faith, and ministry. And I'm delighted to say I am here today with Shane Claiborne. Shane is a prominent speaker, activist, and author. He's recently been touring America asking Christians to surrender their guns to be melted down into tools. It's a vision based on the Old Testament prophets, and he's looking to do something very similar here in the UK, only with knives. We'll talk about that in a moment. But when he isn't melting guns into garden tools, he heads up Red Letter Christians, which he co-founded with the prominent American Christian leader Tony Campolo. Shane is also the author of a number of books, including Jesus for President and The Irresistible Revolution. Shane Claiborne, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Can I please have your accent as well? Can you give me some lessons?
I wish I could put that in a little bottle for you, but yeah.
That's a shame. We'll have to try and figure out a way of me learning to speak. Southern American, is that the term?
I'd say that's good. Yeah, Southern.
Very good.
Yeah,
So
I grew up in Tennessee. You know, that's our Bible Belt, deep South. So yeah, it's
amazing. Cool. So tell me more about Tennessee, which I'm guessing is quite different to London. Tell me about life growing up and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, man. Well, I grew up in a small town, a small family too. My dad died when I was pretty young. So my mom and I are tight. I'm an only child, only grandchild on both sides. Yeah. So, and Tennessee is known for, it's known for its southern hospitality. You know, so it's a beautiful place in the mountains, the Smoky Mountains. It's also where Dolly Parton's from, so Dollywood and all that. You know, I remember when she won the Kennedy Award or something. My uncle goes, I remember when she used to play on the porch. You know, so that's my I think it was my great grandfather was the mailman by horseback. So I'm you know, my folks are hill people. And there's also some things to yet be redeemed. You know, we still really have a lot of the residue of slavery and racism. The Ku Klux Klan, we have a park that's named after one of the founders of the KKK. So in my high school growing up, we had the Confederate flag everywhere. It was the Maryville High School Rebels. But I mean, a lot of that's shifting and changing, and I just went back to my high school, public high school, and I spoke for the 100-year anniversary or something. I gave them a book that Mother Theresa had signed for the public school library. So anyway, that's that's where I grew up, and I always wanted to keep celebrating my family and some of the good things that are worth celebrating, but I also wanted to get outside of that. And that's what brought me to Philly. You know, I went to Eastern University, but my mom was an 11-hour drive from Tennessee. My mom was like, if God wants you to go that far, God can pay for it, you know. And so I got a scholarship, and God made the way, you know. But
it's really interesting. I mean, we'll go on to talk about some of this, but as you kind of grow up and get older, and I guess as a Christian, you look back on your family and your culture, and I guess you do try and identify what was good and what was godly about that culture, but what also wasn't good and what wasn't right. And we'll come on and talk about that. But you mentioned your mum said, you know, if you want to go that far off to college, then God will have to pay for it. So was Christian faith kind of always there in your family background?
Yeah, my mom always took me to church, and we kind of bounced around a little bit. Being a single parent family, my mom had also been through a divorce, and the church isn't always as gracious as we could be, and so we went a few different places before we found a really warm church that I grew up in, and it happened to be Methodist, so I've got the Methodist roots, you know, and I've still really embraced a lot of that Wesleyan. I love John Wesley and that history, and but you know, I saw the Methodist crosses with the fire on it, and I saw the fire throughout the history of the Wesleyan tradition, but like it still felt a little like that fire was on the hymnal on the altar, but I wanted more of that. So I met these Pentecostal guys in my high school, and they were very charismatic, you know, and I was half joking on a little dare from my Methodist friends, went over and said, I heard you guys speak in tongues and believe in miracles. And they they were like, yeah.
Yeah.
Come on. And so I went to worship there, and I fell in love with the charismatic church. So I got rebaptized because none of that sprinkling stuff, you got to go under the water. But I also really saw the Spirit move there, and I became a believer in miracles and in the Spirit. So I've got this, I've become kind of this mutt, blended, and now, with Catholic Church and, later with working with Mother Theresa, all those things kind of have shaped me, but certainly, that's a big part of who I am, I guess, the Methodist charismatic fusion. Yeah.
You mentioned working with Mother Theresa, and I have to say, every time I've heard you speak or give interviews, you've talked about Mother Theresa, and I have to say, if I worked with Mother Theresa, I would do the same. How did that come about?
Well, she's also, it's a part of who has really shaped our spirituality and our community in Philly. When we started thinking about who's someone that has really lived out their faith, she was an exemplary model of that, and happened to be alive, unlike John Wesley and Dorothy Day and St. Francis of Assisi.
So
all
you
these
kind
other
of
people.
sought her out then?
Yeah, we did. We wrote her a letter, and then she didn't write back, and so we just that we were 18, and nothing was impossible. So we ended up calling some different orders of hers, and they gave us a number, and she picked up the phone, and invited us to come to India. So some of my friends in Philadelphia, we went out there, and I've been a couple of times. So I worked in the orphanages and in the home for the dying. I lived in a village that she had started with folks that were outcasts, mostly by skin diseases, leprosy, and other skin diseases. And so, it was massive in shaping me.
Hugely formative experience. I guess those experiences have just so lived with you that those things still inspire you today, and it's just at the forefront, I guess, of your thinking and the way you speak, and because she was such a huge character, I suppose, and influence in your life. Yeah,
a lot of what she talked about, even for our community. The name, The Simple Way, is the name of my community in North Philly. She wrote a book called The Simple Path, I think it was. But one of the things that she said is following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. It's about love. It's about loving God and loving our neighbors. And so, but the kind of simplicity of her love and her love for Jesus, she called Jesus her spouse. And so the intimacy that she had, but she also didn't really like all the hype, and hoorah. And she said, what's important is not doing great things, but doing small things with great love. And so it's not how much we do, but how much we love we put into every act. So that for a long time at The Simple Way, we had right above our door, today, let's do small things with great love, or not even answer the door. That was really what has shaped kind of our charism, or our vibe is let's try to meet people with as much love as we can. And what's important is not how many people we feed today, but do people feel loved as we do it.
So tell me more about The Simple Way. What exactly is it? Is it a church? Is it a community? What is it?
Yeah, so we went to India, I think it was like 95 or 96, and we came back. And I always say one of the things we learned in India is you don't have to go to Calcutta to find Calcutta. Mother Teresa said Calcuttas are everywhere if we'll only have eyes to see. So pray that God would give you the eyes to see the opportunities where you are. So right after that, we came back, and one of the catalytic things for us in Philly had been a group of homeless moms who they didn't have many options, and there were, it's our fastest growing homeless population is women and children, but there's the least amount of shelter space and stuff. So they had been had moved into an abandoned church, a Catholic building, and they were living there, and they were being evicted. So we came alongside of them, and then out of that, experience and reading in the book of Acts, the early church shared everything they had. That all was really powerful for us, and we ended up pulling our money together. Wasn't a lot, as college students in the 90s, but we pulled our money together, bought a house, and over the years, we bought other abandoned houses and moved into them, or, some of them we got for as cheap as $1,
Wow.
so you just built this little village. And last year was our 20th anniversary, and we've got gardens and a greenhouse and murals and, all kinds of programs and stuff, but mostly it's home. And we've been building up that neighborhood for the last 2 decades.
Where did the red letter Christian movement, idea, encounter, where did that first come in for you?
A friend of ours was being interviewed, actually down in my home state in Tennessee, and it was it's worth noting that it was not a Christian radio show. It was a country music DJ who had Jim Wallace, friend of ours, on as a guest, and they were talking. He said, "You know what? The DJ said to Jim, I've read a lot of the Bible, and there's parts of it that I love, but there's also parts of it that I find really confusing and even troubling, And he said, but I've always liked the stuff in red." And he was talking about, the old Bibles had the words of Jesus in red. And so he just said it so nonchalantly, and he said, you guys like the stuff in red. You should call yourselves red letter Christians, because there's a lot of other Christians that don't seem to pay much attention to the stuff in red. And but it kind of stuck, and so we've often joked that Gandhi said, I love Jesus, I just wish the Christians acted more like him, So we want a Christianity that acts like Jesus again, that reads the Sermon on the Mount and said, what if Jesus meant that stuff?
So Red Letter Christians started in America. You and Tony Campolo founded it. You say Jim Wallace was involved?
Yeah, Jim
as well.
And other folks. But we also realized that there's a lot of older white folks, and Tony and Jim, Ron Sider, all these folks have been ringing the bell of Jesus and justice for a while. Yeah. But there's a whole new generation. Right. There's a whole there's all kinds of social shifts happening, in our country right now. But we also see them in the church and specifically, I think, in evangelicalism. As we see that. So a big goal of ours from the beginning is to decenter the white voices only and to build a real diverse and beautiful community.
And Red Letter Christians is now in the UK, has a presence
we're launching it. Ash Barker and Sally and so many other folks that all over the UK will be launching this thing.
So it's really about, I guess, rediscovering, if that's the right word, the red letters of the Bible. As you say, the words that are printed in red in some Bibles, the words of Jesus. And I guess your analysis would be that some Christians we've actually skipped over what Jesus himself said, and maybe we've gone more to Paul or to the other parts of the New Testament, and we're in danger of neglecting the red letters. So is it a case of just trying to remind us that those red letters are there? Because I know some people get a little bit uncomfortable when they think, well, surely you're not suggesting that the rest of the Bible isn't important. You're not suggesting, not all of the Bible is the Word of God. So how do you deal with that kind of criticism that might say, you don't want to overemphasize one bit of the Bible over the other, do you?
Well, so here's the thing: is that it's not that we're not saying the black letters don't matter. The whole Bible isn't the Word of God or something like that. But I think what we're saying is that Jesus is the lens through which we read the Bible and through which we interpret both the Bible and the world we're living in. That we don't just have the Word on paper; we have the Word become flesh. And what has happened for a lot of folks, I think, is they're actually interpreting Jesus through the lens of the Old Testament or through the lens of Paul's writing, and we end up. Tony often says, he quotes a sociologist that said, God created us in his image and we decided to return the favor. So we kind of made Jesus into our image and into who we want him to be. And I think as we see Jesus as the hermeneutic, it's a big word, but as our interpreting tool for the scripture, when verses are misused and pulled out of context, or they're used in different ways, when Bible verses seem to be competing against each other, Jesus becomes the referee. Right. And Jesus is our sounding board. And I think what we see in Christianity in the U.S. right now, evangelicalism, white evangelicalism, there's different iterations of that here in the UK. But in the U.S., the fact that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, you see wow, the same people that led me to Jesus in the Bible Belt in East Tennessee have led us to Donald Trump. And when we look at Jesus and bounce things, bounce Trump off Jesus, and not just Trump, but the policies, the administration, the state of our country, you see a pretty deep contrast.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is we've kind of conflated these different allegiances.
It's so true what you say about us all, the danger of us all trying to make Jesus in our own image, making God in our own image. I think of a friend of mine who isn't a Christian, but he noticed, Sam, why is it that every painting and picture of Jesus, why is it that he's always white? Wasn't Jesus dark-skinned? And you think,
right.
Isn't that interesting that someone who isn't even a Christian has noticed how we have made Jesus in our own image, rather than, as you say, going back to the text and saying, hey, Jesus told us to do some pretty radical, difficult, crazy things, and are we really willing to follow through on that?
Yeah, and it gets really bad. You in the U.S. right now, there are bumper stickers that have Jesus with an assault rifle, and it says if Jesus had a gun, he might still be alive. You're like, whoa. We have politicians right now that are arguing that if it weren't for the death penalty, Jesus wouldn't have died and saved the world. So God loves the death penalty.
Wow.
This is and that sounds like kind of wild, I think, to folks in the UK. But that's why we keep coming back to Jesus. Is the best corrective to this toxic forms of evangelicalism is Jesus. And that's the irony of it, is that when we lose our center on Jesus, we end up talking about things that Jesus didn't talk a lot about, and we don't talk about the things that Jesus said a whole lot about. And so it really recenters us. And even Jesus said things like that. He said, you've heard it said. He said, Moses told you this. And things like the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's part of why I wrote a book on the death penalty that celebrates the Old Testament and sees Jesus as the fulfillment of that. But Jesus is saying that this idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, I want to show you what that really, where this idea takes us, and so with the death penalty, I think that idea that it was limiting the harm that we could do to someone. So it was the idea of reciprocal justice. If you poke my eye out, I can poke your eye out. But Jesus is going to say, hey, maybe we can even do better than that.
Yeah.
You may have a legal right to harm the person in as much as they've harmed you, but I'm going to show you a way to do even better than that.
Are you hoping that red letter Christian is a kind of label that people might start using instead of evangelical Christian, that people might say, I am a red letter Christian?
Well, we're not really trying to start a brand or a franchise as much as a movement that is centered on Jesus again. But I think we need new language. And part of what's kind of provocative and imaginative about red letter Christians is people are like, what does that mean? Or like, and they, you kind of creates a conversation. Yeah. And some of our words have just gotten stale, like evangelical. The root of evangelical means good news. The problem is many evangelicals, the news that they're bringing doesn't look very good to a lot of folks. And so while we love the evangel, the gospel, the good news, we want to create some new language that can carry that into the world we live in right now.
So let's talk a bit about beating guns.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about beating knives as well. But let's start with the book and the context it's written in. I think it's pretty obvious to almost everyone outside of America, and of course it's obvious to many Americans as well, that America has a huge problem, a huge issue with guns. The difficulty, I imagine, inside America is there's competing and conflicting voices on how we solve that problem. So what's your take on America's gun problem and what we do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there are folks in the U.S. especially that will say this is not a gun problem, it's a heart problem. And what we want to say is it's both. It's a heart problem and a gun problem. And God heals hearts, and people change laws and create policies that protect lives. And so we could get rid of every gun, and people will still find ways to kill each other.
Yeah.
In the Boston Marathon, it was actually a pressure cooker that was turned into a bomb. So we can drive cars into crowds and make them weapons. But there are some things that are created to kill, and they're designed to take life, like an AR-15, an assault rifle, designed to take as many lives as possible, as quickly as possible. And that's exactly what they keep getting used for. And so the question becomes like, do assault rifles belong on our streets? And Can we do a better job at protecting lives than protecting people? We've kind of protected guns better than we protected people. So can we do a better job at protecting lives? Right now we have 105 lives lost every day in America. And it's also why it's so ironic that Donald Trump, and offensive, that he would come over and say the hospitals here are awash with blood from knife violence. You're like, yeah, you got 105 lives every single day, 38,000 a year being lost to guns. And he's taken $30 million from the NRA, from the National Rifle Association. So we've got a lot of problems. But so God heals hearts. And that's why I think we do need to see this as something that goes all the way back to Cain and Abel, a sin of a brother killing a brother. And that violence has many iterations throughout history. But in that original story, it says the blood cried out to God from the ground. And so God feels this pain of violence. And that's what we want to do, first of all, is sensitize ourselves to the fact that this is not normal and not okay, and it breaks God's heart. It should break our heart. So part of the power of what we're doing with the melting of guns is it sensitizes people. I think it stirs people in a way that just books or debates or hearing a talk can't.
Yeah. And you've got an example of this right here with you. You talk about melting down guns. You show us
man.
This.
I brought this. I managed to check this legally in my bag, and but this is a plow. This is one of the garden tools that we've made that it formerly was an AR-15. So this was one of those kind of assault rifles. That's the weapon of choice. And we took this off the streets of Philly, melted it down into this hand tool for the garden. And this is what we've been doing all over the country. So I just came off a 37-city tour with my friend he's the main blacksmith. Our organization is called Raw Tools, which is war flipped backwards.
Oh, wow.
So rawtools.org. That's how you can check out the stuff we've made. But we make all kinds of shovels and other things.
This is inspired by the Old Testament prophets, isn't it? This isn't just, it's an amazing idea. It's a great idea, but it's not like you came up with it. There's a few verses, isn't there, in the Old Testament that talks about beating spears into plowshares.
Yeah, exactly. Both Micah and Isaiah, the prophets, speak of God's people beating their swords into plows, their spears into pruning hooks. And then there's a number of other beautiful images of kind of the world that God dreams of for us and prophesies through the prophets. But it ends by saying, nation will not rise up against nation. People will learn violence no more. They'll study war no more. That kids will be able to play without fear, things like this. So it's a beautiful image. But we love that it does begin with us.
Mm-hmm.
It begins with people that decide not to kill and to transform the tools and weapons of death into tools of life. So we've been taking guns all over the country. I've got a whole basement full of chopped up guns, and I've got a blacksmithing forge and shop in Philly now, and we're kind of creating a network around the country. Yeah. But we have more guns than people in the U.S. Yeah. We've got 5% of the global population in the U.S., but almost half of the world's guns, and we're producing the world's guns in the U.S. We have. Right now, we're producing 9.5 million guns a year. That's one gun every 3 seconds.
Wow. It's so ingrained culturally in America, isn't it? I mean, I know this. I've observed this as an outsider just visiting your country. I've been in a church before, amazing church, wonderful Christians worshiping God, and suddenly become aware there are a number of people standing there in the congregation, lifting their hands in worship, and of course inside their jacket is a gun. They're holding a gun on them at that time, and this is just an ingrained way of life for a lot of people in America. I mean, how do you address that? Would you say as a Christian you shouldn't be carrying a gun, or do you not want to be that restrictive? How does this work out practically for a Christian living in America, where it is legal to carry a gun on your person, and there might be the way you were brought up, or it might just be a genuine safety thing of, hey, if someone ran into this church and tried to shoot everyone, I've got protection on me. How do you think about those sorts of issues?
And I just want to say that one of the things that we took around the country with us is a Bible case that my friend is a pastor, gave it to me, and he said it's one of the top selling Bible cases in the U.S. And it's got a cross and it says Holy Bible on the front. You open it up and it is a gun case. It's designed for a gun, but camouflaged as a Bible case. And it's designed for Christians to carry guns to church and in public. So, I mean, this goes deep, and we have pastors that are telling their people, bring your guns to church. There's a whole underground network of folks that are protectors of the flock,
right,
that arm and bring guns to church. So what I would say is that the cross and the gun give us two very different versions of power. And one says, I'm willing to die, and the other says, I'm willing to kill. And the idea of the gun enthusiasts, not just gun owners, but there's a certain gun population that are very extremists, and their ideas of stand your ground, look very different from Jesus's love your enemies and turn the other cheek. And so these are conflicting messages that I think every Christian has to try to navigate and reconcile. And I find it impossible to reconcile the NRA with the Sermon on the Mount, or a gun in one hand with a cross in the other.
I guess my question is, would you find it impossible to reconcile someone who is not a gun enthusiast, but who is carrying a weapon and takes it to church with the mentality of, if someone walked into this building seeking to do one of those terrible mass shootings, I could take him out? To use a phrase they might want to use. Do you find that way of thinking about carrying a gun impossible to reconcile with the way of Jesus as well? Well,
I think first that we need a healthier, better conversation on guns in America, and we did a lot of research for our book to dispel some of the myths that guns make us safer, and that the NRA's language is a bad guy with a gun is stopped by a good guy with a gun, and is that really the case? Are guns the most effective way? So I think we can have really good conversations about that, and that's why I don't want to see the enemy as gun owners. I mean, half my family owned guns. Right. I grew up with guns, but they were for hunting, and I even think that our idea that arming teachers, arming congregation members. We had someone in an hour from where I live in Tennessee that made this argument, went to church, to the board of elders and trustees, and was making his case, we need guns in our church. And the gun went off and shot his wife as he's making his case. Thank God she survived. Wow. But I mean, this is how wild our reality is. And also I think when we have a country that is so saturated with guns that people are constantly in fear, and then they're going, we need more guns to protect us from our guns, and it becomes a pathology. But I also think underneath that, there's a spirituality to this. There is a dynamic of idolatry in this, and I don't think it's extreme language to say that we've made idols of guns. We've attributed godlike power to something that is not God. Yeah. We are looking for it to deliver us and save us and keep us safe. And these are exactly the things that the prophets decry as idolatry. And they say some may trust in chariots and horses, some may trust in their Glock, but we are to trust in God to deliver us. So, and I think you can make a case that guns have worked in protecting people. And I think you can make a case that a lot of other things have worked in protecting us. So in the end, the question for me is, what looks like Jesus? What is most faithful to Jesus?
I'm Sam Hales. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. It's The Profile this afternoon. I'm talking to Shane Claiborne, the social activist, author and campaigner. Hear more of our conversation coming up right after this. Do you want to stay informed on the best of what's happening in the UK church today? Premier Christianity magazine is for you. The UK's leading Christian magazine is published every month and features interviews with Christian leaders, in-depth reporting, reviews, columnists, and loads more. And best of all, you can try it for free. Head to our website now to request the latest edition worth £5.95 completely free of charge.
Visit premierchristianity.com/free sample. The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Welcome back to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Sam Hales. I'm the editor of the UK's leading Christian magazine, that's Premier Christianity. If you'd like a free sample copy of our latest issue, why not go ahead and request one absolutely free of charge. We will send you a print copy of the latest issue, no cost whatsoever. Simply go to premierchristianity.com/free sample. Type your address in, we'll get one out to you. Time now to rejoin the rest of my conversation with the social activist Shane Claiborne. We've been talking lots already about gun violence in America. So let's pick up the rest of our conversation now. I think that idea of Christian non-violence is one that I've seen growing among many Christians in this country, and I think your country as well. And indeed, you've been a key figure in that, of saying we cannot use violence, and even arguing that the early Christians had that attitude as well. You've used the term non-violence. Would you be comfortable with a label like pacifist as well? Is that the kind of language you would use personally to say, I think Jesus would have been against all war, therefore I'm against all war?
Well, I have a certain resistance to these labels,
right?
Because I think that sometimes what they do is they kind of confine us. You know, they
Sure.
can be very unhelpful. They just create these camps and categories, and I think Jesus blew away categories.
Right.
I believe that Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and that we have to be as willing to die for the cross that people have been willing to die, as people have been willing to die for the gun or the bomb or war. And until our courage even gets close to the courage that people have had for violent solutions to problems, then we will continue to, I kind of think, just be background noise, and all of that.
You've seen some of this, haven't you, when you've travelled? I know you've been to places like Iraq, is that right?
I've been to Iraq, I've been to Afghanistan, and I've seen the horror of what our governments are capable of. I lived in Baghdad in March of 2003 during the bombing of Baghdad, what was, in our country is called the shock and awe campaign, but it was at points over 900 bombs a day falling on Baghdad. And to see that kind of horror and experience it and go, this is what we're calling peace? This is what we're calling the solution? The cure is as bad as the disease, it looks like the very thing that and that's what friends of mine that went over there as soldiers, they said, I went over to get rid of terrorism, but we were creating it. We were adding fuel to a fire. And you think now, 15, 20 years after 9/11, have we made the world safer? What if we had had a different imagination after 9/11, not to respond with revenge and violence and retaliation and in like kind, an eye for an eye, right? If we had had some sort of more Christ-like imagination, how might the world be different?
Let's talk about beating knives, because we're here in the UK, and the last thing I'd want to do is suggest that all the problems are in America, because they're not. We have incredible problems with knife crime here at the moment. Just at the time of recording over this past weekend, there's been 3 or 4 fatal stabbings just in London. It's not a problem confined to London. Actually, you talk to people in other parts of the country, this is a UK-wide problem. Been going on for people may think it's for months. It's actually more like years now. There's been a really serious problem of knife crime, especially amongst a lot of young people in this country. And you're coming in and you're bringing the Beating Knives tour to the UK. So it's a similar kind of concept, isn't it, of turning these weapons that have been used for harm and turning them into something more positive and for good. So tell us a bit about Beating Knives. Yeah,
well, I'm also want to be very careful that my posture is not like we're coming over to, solve your knife problem. There are folks that recognize that while it's not a gun problem, that it doesn't mean that the UK doesn't have any violence. Yeah. And so they saw the knives as a great opportunity to do that. So I was invited here. Yeah. There's, local blacksmiths and metal crafters, and also people who have been victims and survivors of this that we're working with, just like we did in the States. But I think part of what is common is that we want to sensitize ourselves. That these are, I saw the statistics, 40,000 incidents of knife violence last year, that the child victim rate is doubled in the last 5 years. So, but those can just be numbers. And so what this does, I think it goes, each of these is a child of God, made in the image of God, and we want to grieve that violence. That blood still cries out to God from the ground, and this is a way to do that. And as I saw these knives, they're not just, I've got plenty of knives, old hunting knives and different knives, pocket knives, but these are like, some of these are 2 feet long, and they're got teeth on them, they're curved, and I mean they're really they're designed to hurt.
Yeah.
And some of these were crime knives. They're not just amnesty knives. They're crime knives that were used. And so as you see them transformed, and we saw these kids, like 6, 7 years old, and you think, what's it doing with their imagination as they're transforming this metal into something else? So we made these art pieces. I think we're making a phoenix, and we're going to go see the knife angel.
Yes, there is a knife angel
right?
already.
So, so this is happening all over the world. Our friends in Mozambique have made saxophones out of assault rifles. Pedro Reyes and others had 1,000 guns from Mexico that they turned into a whole symphony orchestra. So they've got a violin and a xylophone. Another person made, after the Jewish shooting, they made a menorah out of recycled metal to reclaim that. And in the West Bank, they are taking the tear gas canisters and making Christmas ornaments from Bethlehem and making beautiful things out of ugly things. So but it's that prophetic imagination, that we will turn the metal of death into metal of life.
That must be. You mentioned the West Bank. I mean, that must be very hard, because it's one of those situations where Christians on both sides feel so strongly, don't they, about that particular conflict with Israel and the Palestinians. And it seems like whatever you say on that subject, you're going to be criticised or perhaps misunderstood. I get the impression, though, you're trying to do ground level reconciliation, peace work, perhaps more than necessarily commenting on the rights and wrongs of the political conflicts. Is that right? With a situation like that, where people feel so strongly on both sides that this is a justice issue and my team are right, how do you untangle that one?
Well, the beginning part, I think, is keeping our heart sensitive, as Jesus was. Jesus wept over Jerusalem because they didn't know the things that lead to peace, right? And so we need to grieve with everyone who's grieving. Just Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." So we're to be sensitive to whoever is a victim of violence. Like, that matters to God, right? So when I've been in Israel and Palestine, I think that we do a lot of listening. My friend Sami Awad, who's a Palestinian Christian, he said, God's been changing his heart. He said that the Spirit led him to go to Germany and to track some of the Jewish history and the Holocaust. And he went to the concentration camps. He went to the Holocaust Memorial. And he said, now I come back, and my heart aches for what happened to my Jewish brothers and sisters. And he says, that now I see the wall, and I used to see hatred, and now I see fear.
Right.
It doesn't justify indefensible things, but it does say, like, it helps you understand them, And so I think what happens often is when we've been hurt, we transfer some of that hurt and that fear and anxiety, that some of it's very understandable in history. So, but yeah, I think that I often I'm not pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. We're pro both. We're pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. We're pro-Jesus, and that means that. But it also means calling out the inequities. And a lot of my Palestinian Christian friends, I mean, a lot of them could care less if it's a 2-state, 1-state. They just want to be seen as equal people. They want to be seen as made in the image of God and have as much dignity as anyone else, there. So, yeah. But I think, like, we were just talking about bringing the forge to the wall in Israel and Palestine. In the West Bank, we'll melt some guns on both sides and some.
Wow.
But yeah,
that would be quite the project, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
Amazing. I love that. I love that vision, though, of something very creative, very different. It's still campaigning, isn't it? It's still saying, we're against weapons.
Well, it's calling out all violence, no matter who's holding the gun.
Yeah. But it's doing it in a hopeful way, I suppose. Because, given we've already dealt with some very deep and difficult topics in this interview, do you ever have days when you are just kind of despairing? Because you strike me as an optimist.
Oh, that's sweet. Yeah.
But I think, some of this must be quite heavy as well. And are there times where you just think, I don't know how to fix this.
Well,
the world's gone wrong. This is all terrible.
I've had a lot of friends that have taught me the difference between, optimism and hope. That it's not just wishful thinking, or I'm not, I just, but it's actually, believing that, being certain of what we do not see. And that's exactly what this is about, and the prophets are foretelling. Is like my friend Walter Brueggemann, he wrote this book, The Prophetic Imagination. He's been a great supporter of all this. And he says, we sometimes misunderstand the prophets. We think that they were trying to foretell the future, predict the future, but they were actually trying to change the present. They were trying to name where we're at right now so that we can build a different future together. So that idea, I love, it's been said, some people see the world as it is and say why, and other people dream of the world and as it could be and say why not, and that's what we want to do. We want to see a piece of metal that's designed to kill and go, sure, but in an hour it's going to be something different. And that's the beauty, I think, of what we're doing too, is there's power as you see like concrete change. We keep seeing all these politicians go in circles. We see another mass shooting and, politicians offer thoughts and prayers, and we're going like, we need change, like and so you can see that actually happen in the period of a 2-hour event or something. Right. But what's also is it's not just symbolic. Like there's healing that is happening. It's giving space for grief and for public lament and to name that this is not, okay, it's very hard to argue. We've had so many gun owners and police officers, military folks that come to the forge and they are weeping as they see a weapon transform because they've all got their own stories of violence. And one person, will take the hammer. I remember this one mom as she's beating on the gun. Every hit of the hammer, she said, "This is for my boy." Her son was killed, of course, and she transformed that. But then we had another young man, took the hammer, he started counting. 1, 2, counts up to 18. And I was like, that's interesting, and he just kind of left. And afterwards, he's off the side, very emotional, big guy, I said, "You want to share?" And he said, "I counted 18 times for the 18-year-old man that I killed." So he had been on the other side of this, and what we see kind of mystically happen as we meet at the forge is like God is healing the victims and the victimizers. God's healing the, those who have hurt and those who have been hurt. And that's how big God's grace is,
Plenty of people have described you as a radical. What do you think of that?
Well, I love the word in its truest form, so I always like kind of do a little clarity. Like the word radical means root, like a radish. It's about getting at the root of what it means to be Christian. It doesn't just mean extreme and crazy, wild. I think it means, in its truest form, it means the roots. So it's
going back to the roots.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Another word that has a similar connotation is fundamentalist. And you did an interview with us back in 2010. You said this. You said, "I think that one of the most dangerous things in the church has not just been fundamentalism, but selective fundamentalism, where we choose those things that God really meant." And then he said, when it comes to Jubilee, I'm a fundamentalist, baby.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how selective we are in the we literally, I just heard a haunting sermon from someone in Tennessee arguing that from the Old Testament that we should execute gay and lesbian folks. Like that, this was a true, this is not 100 years ago. This is like last week, and yet like that, it's interesting what we've been so selectively fundamentalist about. And then you go, what about the Jubilee? Like what if we actually did even imagine what the spirit of Jubilee would mean: redistribution of land, forgiveness of debt.
And actually, on this point, I'm going to have to ask you to explain what Jubilee is, which I think actually me having to ask you to explain that, doesn't that say a lot about where we're at as a Christian culture? That every Christian I know knows exactly what LGBT is and knows exactly what they think about it, but many will not even have encountered this biblical idea of Jubilee. So give us a bit of a explanation as to what it is and why you're a fundamentalist about it.
Well, it was God's original plan of realignment of our inequity. So it was a systemic interruption of our inequality between the super rich and super poor. And so just like today, I think God foresaw all of this, right? That we would have a few people that continue to accumulate massive amounts of wealth while the masses of people have increasing poverty. So you have the super rich getting richer and the super poor
Sounds
getting
familiar,
poorer.
doesn't it?
And so God said there needs to be an interruption,
Right.
and there was a series of these, but the Jubilee was kind of the climax, the finale of that, where land was to be redistributed. So that accumulation would be interrupted. Slaves were to be set free, enslaved people set free. The land was to rest, which there's tons of wisdom in that for our climate and our environment. Debts were to be forgiven. And
Right.
sure, man, that's a good one too.
Yeah.
That you think of all of the debts and also I think it was just as much for the rich as it was for the poor. Like we have folks that they have more than they're ever going to imagine spending. We have less than 100 people that own the same amount as half the world. So, Gandhi said there's enough for everybody's need, but there's not enough for everybody's greed. And that's what God was, but there also was it's interesting to me because there was a process for it. It was meant to be a regular part of our life. And some folks will say, well, the Jewish community never really celebrated the Jubilee. And one of my friends got a great response. He says, well, Christians haven't always celebrated the Sermon on the Mount or followed the Sermon on the Mount, but it doesn't take away from the legitimacy of it, But that's another one. You think of the Sermon on the Mount and you're like, some would say red letter Christianity is trying to take literally, these verses, sell what you have and give it to the poor. So we're just trying to read the whole scripture and go, what is God saying to us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I need to check I'm not wearing my expensive shoes at this point because we're going to talk about, Christianity and consumerism. Am I right in thinking, I know at one point you were making your own clothes. Is that still true?
Yeah, I made these pants here. So I make as much as I can.
Yeah.
Part of it came, there were a couple of things, when I was in India, they made everything, the saris that Mother Theresa and the sisters wore, the blue and white saris, they are made in the little village I lived in. And for Gandhi, the spinning wheel was a central part of the movement. Let's not be dependent on these oppressive structures. Let's live locally, grow things locally. So that's a part of our ethos as much as it can be. So I love making stuff or knowing where stuff came from. Even these shoes, I didn't make these shoes. I tried making shoes. It's hard. But these shoes, I know the company that makes them. I know how the workers are treated, and I think that's what we want to do more and more is like,
it's really
try
hard.
to see
speaking as someone who looked into this, admittedly some years ago, I need to update myself, but when I looked into it, it was like, I can't shop there anymore because they don't treat people well. And I started to shop some places that were more expensive, thinking, well, I don't mind paying a bit more. I can afford to pay a bit more, but it's important, I think, as a Christian, we shop in places where people are getting a fair wage. Then, of course, I discovered that the expensive brands were just as bad as the cheap brands.
And
it's like one of those things, the more you look into it, almost, not the more complicated it gets, but the more you look into it, the more you realize this injustice is everywhere.
Yeah, it's entangling.
I mean, we've had it in this country recently with the government saying that big companies now under law must look to see if there is slavery in their supply chains. And of course, the shocking thing is in almost everything that we buy in the West, and this is changing because companies look into it, they're trying to change it. But there is often slavery in the supply chains of some of the everyday things that that I buy for sure.
Yeah.
You're different. You're saying, well, one way around that is to create your own stuff because you know that there's been no slavery involved in making those trousers because you did it yourself.
Yeah, and part of the thing is that we end up creating layers that separate us from where our food or clothing comes from. So because I think we have a conscience, we don't want to know if it's unjust, And I in my first book I wrote about Philip Knight, who was the head of Nike at the time, and this documentary filmmaker asked him, he goes, I got 2 tickets for us to go to Indonesia because I want you to walk me through the factories where the shoes are made, And he says, No, I'm not going to do that. Philip Knight says, have you ever been there to the factories where Nikes are made? He says, no, I've never, and I won't go.
Wow.
And you're like, part of what I hear in that is he's got a conscience, but that's dangerous, to have invisible people. And, at the time too, I think it was Michael Jordan was making more money advertising Nikes than all of the people together made making those shoes. So those inequities, they only surface when we know people. So if Michael Jordan went to those shops, I'm sure he'd have some things to say, and that's where, even in our country, the farm workers that now we know are picking the tomatoes and other vegetables at all our fast food chains. I've been working with a coalition of immokalee workers that are, now when I go to, I get something at Taco Bell or whatever, I know, like, I might know the person that picked that tomato, and I am proud that we fought hard together, marched together, went to jail together, trying to make sure that modern day slavery is not tolerated in the U.S. and that they have enough to feed their families. But so, as much as we can, we try to make those invisible faces, visible and know who they are. And I like making stuff. My earrings were, this is bamboo from my backyard, so, but I kind of enjoy that. And I think we're made to make stuff and, to humanize others. So.
How many times have you been arrested?
Oh man, I lost count on that one. I can't, can I count this year? Is that fair?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think I've been arrested like 3 times this year. I told some of our kids, I don't think I will regret any of the arrests during the Trump administration. And we're going to look back on history and say, what were we doing, Right. And
so give us a bit of context to that.
I'll give you a context for that.
Just to reassure people who are listening and think, what terrible crime has Shane committed?
Yeah, well, I tell the kids in our neighborhood, you can get arrested for doing things that are wrong, and you can also get arrested for doing things that are right. And when we get arrested, we're doing things that we believe are right. And Martin Luther King, when he first went to jail in the civil rights movement, he said, I was first disturbed, but then I looked at history and saw what good company I have, starting with Jesus, maybe, and the prophets and so many disciples.
Yeah, Jesus was arrested. That's a fair point.
Yeah, and Dr. King was also accused of being maladjusted, like, why can't you behave a little bit? And he said, we need to be maladjusted in this world that has become way too adjusted to injustice and racism and things that we should never be adjusted to, John Lewis, who's a part of that civil rights movement too, he says that's why we can smile in our jail mugshots, because we know that we're on the right side of history.
Right. Yeah.
So originally, the first time I ever got arrested was for feeding people in Philadelphia. Our city passed unimaginable laws that targeted the homeless, made it illegal to sleep in public places, in the parks, and they made it illegal to share food.
Wow.
And all of that was a systemic, it sounds crazy, but they were trying to, push out homeless folks. That happened all over the United States. So we were arrested. A lot of those laws we were able to win in court and hopefully see some of those that continue to change. It's the same with immigration now, though. 20 years later, we have folks that are getting arrested, that are getting charged with putting water in the desert for asylum seekers, So St. Augustine said, an unjust law is no law at all. It's as much our duty to disobey the bad laws as it is to uphold the good laws. But I think we do that in light of Romans 13. We do that, which calls us to submit ourselves to the authorities. There's 2 ways to, I think, submit to authority. And one of those is by obeying the laws that warrant obedience, and the other is by suffering the consequences of disobeying bad laws, and that's how you change them. And I think that when we expose those injustices by surfacing that, so when you see, like when we went to Iraq during the war, we took medication, and a lot of doctors took medication and basic first aid supplies to the hospitals. That was illegal. They actually went to trial, and they faced up to 12 years in prison for taking medical supplies to Iraq during the bombings. And what happened in the court scene we were a part of is that the federal appointed judge was like, whoa, the state has a hard case on this one to try to prove that these doctors were in the wrong.
What's been the best day of your ministry and what's been the worst day?
Whoa, gosh. When Jesus said the wheat and the weeds are all growing together, it's kind of what it feels like. I mean, every day I wake up, I'm grateful for. And, but yeah, I don't know that I have a best or worst day, but, I'm grateful for every one of them.
How would you describe your calling?
Well, I think my calling is to follow Jesus, to love. We say in our community, love God, love people, and follow Jesus. Whatever else matters.
Simple as that.
Yeah, everything just kind of sums it up.
It's so true. We can so easily complicate things. And I love what we were talking about earlier with how, to take that example again, a lot of Christians would know exactly what they think on sexuality and yet would be completely unaware even of Jubilee and how we might bring that into society today. But nevertheless, I'm sure we both agree theology does matter. And Tony Campolo, who I said you work with, Red Letter Christians, he's had a very well-publicised change of mind on that particular issue on gay marriage. He would now say that God would affirm loving, committed same-sex relationships. So I wanted to ask you, have you been on a journey similar to Tony? Would you hold a traditional perspective on that, or have you, like Tony, changed your mind and you would now say that God would be in favour of committed same-sex relationships?
Mm-hmm. This is one of those things I've certainly, like many things, I've been, as the scripture says, we're working out our salvation with fear and trembling. We're constantly in process. And on the death penalty, I changed my mind. Right. I was for the death penalty. Against it. When it comes to sexuality, this is one of those things that I think is incredibly complex and personal to our community. Yeah. Our community's had sexual minorities from the very beginning for 20 years. I can mark moments that were formative for me. One of them was in college when a friend of mine was telling me that he was gay and is gay and he wanted to kill himself because his whole life he felt like he was a mistake, and he had tried to pray away the gay, he had done all of this, and had demons cast, all that stuff, and he just said, like, this is where I'm at. And I'm thinking, if he can't hear and feel the love of Jesus in the church, then we've missed it. Yeah. I also feel like some of the culture wars have made this really complicated because we end up talking a lot about sex, but not as much about love. And our deepest longing is to love and be loved. And I know from being mentored by a lot of celibate Catholic folks that you can go your whole life without having sex and you can experience love and community very deeply. I also know that there are a whole lot of folks that have sex but don't feel loved. And so the starting point for us is that we want to create communities where people can love and be loved. And I kind of trust that the Spirit's moving in folks, you know? And this is very pastoral for me. Like, because I think, like, there's a lot of folks that go, can you, our continuum for our language is even unclear of affirming, you know, are you fully affirming? Are you loving but not affirming? You know, and you go like, when I think of the heterosexual marriage, it's not like there's a broad brush. I think Donald Trump and I would probably have a very different understanding of the sacrament of marriage, right? and yet, like, so I don't affirm every heterosexual marriage, but I think it's a pastoral thing, right? And so I trust pastors. I'm not a pastor, so I'm not ordained. I don't perform. I don't have the privilege of performing weddings, but I trust pastors to discern that. You know, I think that it's. I do want to say in our communities. And in our network, even in the Red Letter Christians movement, we don't all agree on this. Okay. We agree on love. We agree on community. We have different understandings of same-sex marriage. It's not the line in the sand for us. But this is why, is that there's only like 6 or 7 verses of the Bible that talk about same-sex attraction or relationships, sexual relationships, and they're very different from how we're talking about monogamous, equal relationships of lifelong partners. That was a foreign idea to those contexts, which were much more about abuse and exploitation and of men and women in those situations, and so that makes it really difficult. So at the end of the day, I know that Christians who love Jesus, who love the Bible, can arrive in different places. I believe a tree is known by its fruit.
Mm-hmm.
I have friends that are in lifelong monogamous partnerships with the same gender, and the fruit of their life looks like Jesus. It looks like everything that I know is beautiful, and I celebrate that with them. And I am heartbroken by the way that the church is not able to hold tension and to discern this together. The Methodist Church, right, just had an epic fail where they excluded all the affirming, congregations and folks in the Methodist Church. There was a proposal that would hold the tensions and allow individual churches, even conferences, to disagree and still walk together as a united church. But there are progressive circles that are also in danger of saying this is our line, and if you don't fully affirm same-sex marriage, you can't speak or you're not welcome here. So I don't think that more exclusion is the answer. I think a deeper conversation and a deep listening and respect is the answer.
So for you, it's not an issue where you would kind of draw boundaries on and say, this is a make or break issue for me working with you, or for what it means to be a Christian. And for you, I guess the debate around what is sexually immoral is not a big enough issue to divide church over or to exclude over.
It's one of those things where I work with churches, pastors, organizations that are on that disagree with each other on it, and I want to stay engaged. I want to be a bridge builder. I want to be able to speak into the context with folks that are leaning in and maybe becoming more welcoming and affirming of folks. And for organizations that say this is a deal breaker for us, and I have it on both sides. I have folks like this in the last few months. I've had folks call me and to see if I passed the litmus test, and they've said, so if you will not say publicly that you affirm same-sex marriage, you cannot speak. I've also had folks say, if you say publicly you affirm same-sex marriage, you cannot speak. And that's why I'm not timid about it. I've been talking about this for 20 years, and I stand by everything that I've said. If people want, I think statements are cheap, and they're often meant to put, oh, you're with them, and I'm resistant of that. It's not that I don't have convictions on this or love on this, or feel passionately on this, but I just don't think this should be the line in the sand that we exclude people from our communities in conversation because we disagree. And we've held that tension for years. And you mentioned Tony. Incidentally, Tony and Peggy disagreed on this for years and had a wonderful debate, that everybody should watch. There's a video of it. But then at the end of it, they would say, well, we disagree, and we're still able to go sleep together. And if they can still sleep together, the church sure as heck should be able to still worship together.
We spoke a little bit at the beginning about how we can all have cultural blind spots. So as Christians, we grow up in a particular culture, and perhaps as we grow up, we look back and we think, wow, that wasn't right. And we've spoken a lot about your change of views on things like nonviolence, and what you're doing with beating guns into garden tools and all that good stuff. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on the UK. And you've already put out the disclaimer, as have I, of neither of us are seeking to bash each other's culture at all. But I find it helpful to talk to people who don't come from my culture, from my Christian background, and say, well, what do you notice coming here? So what do you notice in UK Christianity where you think that might be a bit of a blind spot? Because you've been very open about where you think America might have got it wrong with attitudes to guns, and your views on Donald Trump are very well documented, and how Christians have, you would say, arguably kind of got into bed with a particular political idea or even political party. Now, we in the UK, I don't think we seem to have that problem in exactly the same way, but I'm sure we have other problems, other cultural blind spots. I'd love to know if you've noticed any.
Wow. Yeah, you're going to get me in trouble on this one. I'm going to speak with a degree of humility, but, and the right posture. But, I've been here a ton, and there are things that I'm seeing this time that are, there's there's so many similarities. I mean, we're definitely extreme on almost everything happening in our country, but our country's talking about America first.
Right.
And there's this white nationalism. And when people say, make America great again, they're really saying make America white again. Because you think, when was it great for, black folks, people of color? But there's this kind of white identity that's in crisis after the first black president, after a really changing Congress, and the Black Lives Matter movement, all this. So there's this white fragility and this kind of uprising of white supremacy. We're going to take the power back, but that's almost some of the same language that I see in places here. We're going to, we want to take back control. We want to. There's this kind of closing and there's a fear. There's we don't want immigrants or asylum seekers. It looks different over here. But Mother Theresa said one of our biggest problems is that the circle we put around our family is too small. It's an amazing line. The circle we put around our family is too small. And whether it's America First or Brexit or some of these things, I think sometimes what it is about is we're saying our people matter more than other people, or that we can't, or love is a limited resource, or whatever. So I think that's it's dangerous, and that's the problem of nationalism, is that it's not that a love of our people is a bad thing. It's just the circle's too small. We're meant to love as big as God loves, and God loves to be born again. What amazing language Jesus had, what's born of the flesh is flesh. What's born of the spirit is spirit. Our biological family, is wonderful. Our national family is wonderful. But we are born again. So if someone's hurting on the other side of a wall, it's as tragic as if it were our own flesh and blood, our own mother or daughter. And that's the compassion I think Jesus is inviting us into.
Well, if only we had another hour, we could do a whole other hour on Brexit, I'm sure.
Whoa, I'm glad we don't. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm glad we don't, actually. I think, some of us have, on both sides of that particular debate, I think a lot of people are saying we're a bit bored of it and can we talk about something else? But anyway, before we go, one last question. And that is, when all is said and done at the end of the day, how would you like to be remembered?
Wow. I would like to be remembered, I guess I would like to be remembered as one who reminded the world of Jesus. I think of my friend Rich Mullins, and someone said he was an arrow pointing to heaven, and Mother Teresa said we're meant to leave off the fragrance of Jesus. So I hope I left off the fragrance of Jesus.
You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. I'm Sam Hales, editor of Premier Christianity magazine. It's been so great to have your company on the show today. The Profile is where we sit down with a leading Christian and find out more about what makes them tick. I've been in conversation with Shane Claiborne this afternoon. I do hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you'd like to check out more great interviews just like this one, why not have a listen to The Profile as a podcast? Just go to premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. All the links are there to download this show and past episodes. Well over 100 interviews now available through The Profile podcast. My thanks to Shane Claiborne and my thanks to you for joining us this afternoon. We'll see you next time.